Sally, thank you. Research by a charity suggests that more than 670 homeless people died in the UK in 2019. The study by the Museum of Homelessness found almost 40% were living in some form of temporary accommodation. Rachel Stonehouse reports.
Grace, what was George like as a brother?
Well, he was everything that you'd want in a big brother. He was loyal, he was funny. I know some people don't really get on with their siblings, but I was always very, very close to George. I adored him.
George Mahoney died while staying at a hostel called Wick House in Bristol, which claimed to offer support for addictions and mental health.
George was very intent on getting over his addiction, and to that end, not for the first time, he stopped drinking completely. And there was ultimately no alcohol in his system when he died. But he appears to have had a seizure during the night that he died.
George was found in a pool of blood with injuries to his face and neck. The police initially thought he might have been murdered, but a post-mortem recorded his death as sudden, unexpected death in alcohol misuse. But almost 4 years on, his family are still searching for answers.
There wasn't any such support. Largely, these people are left to their own devices.
We've been into a certain extent in limbo a bit as well over the years because we didn't have the closure.
To me, it feels like in that area, vulnerable people that have got alcohol addictions, it is a bit of a grey area and people are exploiting that.
In response, the charity told us the number of deaths was comparatively low and people with addictions live a precarious existence. They also said they couldn't have monitored residents all the time. Following a Charity Commission investigation, Wick House is now run by a new organisation. But I've discovered similar stories across the country, like the Shuttleworth Hostel in London, which has more than 100 rooms.
In 2019, there were 3 deaths here in the space of just 2 months. And like Wick House in Bristol, concerns have been raised about the conditions inside.
John and Nigel, 2 former residents, wanted to share their experience of living there. But John didn't want to show his face.
My room was a bathroom, in as much that what happened was they took the bath out and stuck a bed in it. It wasn't a home at all. It was somewhere to put your head at the end of the day, if you could sleep.
And when Nigel was there, a decomposing body was found.
I think it was 3 or 4 days his body had been rotting there. And there was a guy in the room next to it, and he could smell this, because the walls were very thin. There ought to be something done, investigation into violence and abuse in places like this.
In response, the management of the Shuttleworth Hostel told us it meets all laws governing temporary accommodation and does not tolerate violence or aggression among residents. A project called the Museum of Homelessness has been recording the number of deaths of people living on the street and in hostels. 40% of those who died were living in temporary accommodation.
There's a great deal of variety in the kind of support that people are receiving. Some places are commissioned through local authority funding, but some are kind of privately run, particularly in cities where there's not so much accommodation available. People are very often kind of warehoused together, and that can lead to all sorts of problems. And there's been huge cuts to homelessness services over the last 10 years, and that has created a real issue. And we're seeing, sadly, rising numbers of people dying in temporary accommodation. That's what we found in our research. I think the government really needs to get to grips with it, because they're not at the moment.
Councils in England spent more than £1 billion on temporary accommodation last year, and concerns have also been raised about the lack of regulation in Parliament. For the families affected, they say they won't give up.
As long as I haven't got the answers, I haven't got the inquest, I haven't got the answers about my brother's death that I need, I've got no intention of ever stopping.
Rachel Stonehouse, BBC News.
Well, one MP who's raised this in Parliament is Kerry McCarthy, the Labour MP for Bristol East, where Wick House is based. Hello to you. Why is there no regulator for homeless hostels or supported housing?
Well, it's very much a glaring gap, isn't it? If you have people in care homes, you have the Care Quality Commission that regulates that. And these are vulnerable people, but yet there is no regulation, and there's no good reason why it shouldn't be regulated. I certainly think that it should, and I've got what we call a 10-minute rule bill coming forward next month that will seek to regulate this sector.
You have obviously been involved with what happened at Wick House. It's now under new management. Rachel told us about the Shuttleworth Hostel in London, which told us it meets all laws governing temporary hostels, yet a decomposing body was found there, having been left for several days. How do you react to that?
Well, these are places where they're getting enhanced rate of housing benefit because there's meant to be a supported element. You can't tell me that they're properly supporting residents if they don't notice that someone has been dead for several days, or in this case, it sounds like considerably longer. So there's not the support there. There's all sorts of reports of abuse, enforcement if people can't pay their rents, things like drug dealing. And I've gathered accounts from colleagues across the country. This isn't a problem that's isolated to any particular area.
Yeah.
And you've got these big places like Shuttleworth, like Wick House, but you've also got it happening at a much smaller scale as well.
The government says, quote, "We're clear that all supported housing must be of good quality and meet the needs of the vulnerable people it supports. We're working closely with councils and relevant partners to develop a range of measures to help ensure that oversight is strengthened." Does that give you any reassurance?
Well, I met the minister last year, Luke Hall, who's fairly local to Bristol, so he'd taken a real interest in Wick House. But at the time, the response from the government was that we need to encourage best practice, we need to share information about how councils can sort of spread this good practice. Well, good practice works if someone who's providing this accommodation has the best of intentions. The good providers will sign up to voluntary codes. It's the people that are, operating below the radar, that have no interest in anything other than getting this extra housing benefit money in, these higher rents that they can charge. They're the people that won't be caught by voluntary approach. So no, I don't think the government's approach goes far enough. I'm trying to chase for a response as to how the review that they've been trying to do for the last year or so has been going. But I do think the answer is regulation, which means passing something into law.
Thank you very much for talking to us. Thank you. Kerry McCarthy, Labour MP for Bristol East.